Hello and welcome everyone to this explanation and embellishment stream for the video I released last week. Does Germany exist? Just in general, I want to put this out there that producing short form content is still experimental for this channel, and I can understand if some viewers prefer the standard content for the sake of depth over brevity. If you're one of these people, this stream exists for you. I'll be going through my script point by point, and in some cases responding to the comments I received. I'll be putting 19 segments out in script format, so if you see your point covered there, then that's probably the best time for you to reply to me. If you're listening to this live and had a question from the video, please wait until I reach that relevant section of this video and I'll try and respond, so as not to break the flow of the stream and cause myself to repeat far too often. First, we need to start with the title. As someone who has devoted many hours to the question of nationalism, people shouldn't be surprised by this type of content. Perhaps I've been at this game too long, but typically when someone presents a provocative title with a question mark, almost always the answer will be the most mundane response possible to that question. Does Germany exist? The answer is yes, moving on. Showing my working is the part with value. Someone asked me to define in the comment section what existence means, which is a perfectly legitimate question, but I believe it's also a rather limiting question. Throughout the video, I presented many instances of Germany existing throughout time and the changing nature of that state of existence. Using the definition of how Germany as an assumed nation state ought to exist, using nebulous criteria such as, just for one example, the Montevideo Convention's definition of statehood, i.e. a defined population within a certain territory, is the most easy way to qualify Germany's existence, but as a universal definition, it tells us next to nothing about the essence of Germany's existence, a unique state of existence. Is a point that should have been made obvious when I asked, does Germany exist as a particular, rather than asking whether countries exist in general. Indeed, to ask the question, does Germany exist, based on some of the responses I received, appears to have been inextricably bound up with another question, perhaps a more interesting question. Does Germany have a right to exist? This is a morals question, which as a historian I neither attempted to answer, nor do I feel qualified to answer. So starting off with the first point. In England, they call it Germany. In France, they call it Allemagne. Within it, they call it Deutschland. In Poland, they call it Niemcy. So what is it? The purpose of the introduction was to expose listeners to multiple points. What is in a name? The implications of Germany as a concept, how the concept varies within Germany, and how others perceive Germany from without. People were quick to point out that the Finnish use Saksa or Saxon to refer to the Germans in general also. By referring to Germany as the it, I was attempting to abstract the idea of Germany from the linguistic concept. In a way, I was attempting to dehistoricize Germany, while conceding here that to do so is impossible if I were to try to do so absolutely. For people, by the way, who have questions to ask me, do an @am or an @apostolic majesty, otherwise I won't be able to read all the comments simultaneously and present this as I go. I could have described the it I refer to as the phenomenon, or the construct. By the phenomenon, I will be drawing a direct connection to the school of phenomenology. To oversimplify it, the objective qualification of the subjective intention, to which the concept of Germany definitely applies, especially as phenomenology is to a large extent a German phenomenon. Make of that what you will. Many of you listening to that sentence no doubt believe my writing style seems pretentious enough as is. Germany as a construct would imply artificiality. Yes, the original essay was technically a deconstruction of Germany, but to my original point, to ask, does Germany exist, is to ask, does Germany have a right to exist? To deconstruct is assumed to delegitimate. Again, as that was not my intention, I did not reference Germany as a construct once. Germany is an invention of Julius Caesar's commentaries on the Gallic Wars, a reference to a people across the River Rhine, whom the Romans referred to as Germani. Where the Romans got this term is shrouded in mystery. Some believe that the Germani themselves were not really ancient Romans as a layperson may understand them, but mislabeled Gauls. Whatever the case, this dubious word was embraced by the Romans to label both the region Germania and the people Germans. Given that the tribes across the Rhine lacked a written culture, they weren't in a position to correct the Romans. The fact that the Romans invented the term is significant. I need to note also that I'm not a philologist. I find philology fascinating, but various etymologies of words and asterisk words, that essentially means an assumed or contrived meaning of words in relations to other words or antecedents to words, which are based on a teleological relationship to other words, like the equivalent of a linguistic filling in of the periodic table. Philology is where I and many historians cross the frontier from history to prehistory, i.e., from written accounts to speculative accounts and using other forms of media and historical interpretation. And that is where people like me are most liable to speculate and where people like me are most liable to go wrong. The Latin and Greek speakers used various, often interchangeable words to describe the northern tribes. For example, Gaul is most likely a rendering of the Greek word Galatea. For people who have seen Pygmalion or My Fair Lady, She Who Was Milk White, which also refers to the Galatia region of Anatolia in the middle of Turkey, not just another appellation for modern France. The Latins would have received the original word Germani from the Gauls, who were relatively more advanced than the tribes across the Rhine. It was fascinating going back all the days to doing the original nations of Charlemagne, how advanced the Gauls were and how if they had access to certain alphabets, it wasn't necessarily even the Latin alphabet, but through the Greek port at Massilia, modern-day Marseille, exposure to Greek coinage and the use of the Greek alphabet in terms of the connection between the Gallic tribes and the broader world, but that's sort of moving on beyond the point. So the Latins received this term almost certainly from the Gauls. And to sort of further establish this point of etymology, one historian, Wolfgang Pfeiffer, for example, has linked the word Germani to the Irish word ger, which would mean the word for neighbor, which again, based on an asterisk history, where words ought to belong, would make a degree of sense. But the question is, what neighbors? Are these neighbors to Celts or neighboring Celts? To my point that the original Germani could be mislabeled Gauls. The Romans had encountered so-called Germans before the Cimbrian Wars. The Cimbrian Wars, where the Roman legions fought against the Cimbrians, the Ambrones, and the Teutones. Julius Caesar made the connection between the Teutones and the Germani, and so we have, by extension, through the use of that word, Teutonic, for a whole manner of appellations of German. However, the fact that there is no consensus on what these tribes were, beyond the Roman accounts of their names and their potential origin point in Jutland or northern Germany, is very telling. Same goes for the Helvetic migrations, the Helvetii from Switzerland, who are mostly assumed to be Celtic migratory groups. We have received our knowledge of the ancient Germans third-hand, not simply second-hand, through the Celts. Caesar's war against the Germanic Suebi under Ariovistus during the Gallic Wars is one of these early points of juxtaposition between the Gauls and the Germans. The Roman concept of Germany, I believe, was needed for the Romans to distinguish against the Gauls and to label a territory beyond the Gauls for the purposes of any future conquest. All these elaborations revolve around a central issue for a thesis of German continuity, the lack of a written culture. Point 3. From these labels, we have inherited a misconception that there was both a tribal and a geographic unity, and by implication, continuity of nationhood, where there wasn't any. We have also received the word Germanic, which is far more nebulous in its application, but perhaps far more useful. This point is brilliantly exhibited by the French labeling of it Allemand, The French possess the word Germanic, and yet despite the French language's close similarity to Latin, it is the Germanic English who use the Latin word Germany for the it. So the question must be asked, why? Again, people in the chat, please try and keep this pertinent because I'm trying to simultaneously read and present this as I go along. Point 3 here, the above point, is one of my most contentious points, but I stand by it. The geographical and tribal unity was mostly prescribed by outsiders, not determined by themselves. The most blatant part of this retroactive history, which, funny enough, was missed by the commenters, was the German connection to Hermann or Arminius. Yes, someone is saying in the chat, aren't you confusing statehood with nationhood? Often those two things are used simultaneously, and invariably a nationhood evolves out of a state. The French Revolution being a pivotal example of that. If you're going to come to a more nebulous conception of national belonging or the stirrings of some sort of antecedent to a culture or whatever, that's far more nebulous. Even the concept of nationhood is a relatively modern term. And I'm not confusing any of these terms in this specific aspect. Statehood or nationhood does not apply within this context that I'm referring to the retroactive history of the Germans. So the most blatant part of this retroactive history, which, funny enough, was misused by the which was missed by the commenters, was the German connection to Hermann, or Arminius in English or Latin. At best, this was an attempt to deconstruct my deconstruction by stating that my use of an assumed narrative was proof of a continuity of German nationhood when I was responding to a narrative that had already been constructed. Yes, and someone is saying natio means race, nationhood is the most ancient form of statehood. What do you mean by race, Hook 88? As I'm about to go into, race can mean various things. Indeed, that's obviously going back to the Latin and the Greek etymological roots. Are you talking about the Dorians? Are you talking about the Ionians? What connections, say, for example, do the people of Syracuse have to the people have to the Lacedaemonians, for example? Within the gradations of race, we have to become more granular and get to the denizens of a city and their colonia in the case of Greece. And then, of course, talk about differentiations between the origin point or a home city and its colonia as well. So what you're doing is you're taking a concept which was contrived of historically and then superimposing it. And even then, if you're taking the idea of DNA, that again is implying modern scientific methods and trying to backdate them retroactively to cultures who didn't understand the concept of DNA. So the more you really think into it and delve and try and deconstruct these notions, you're left stymied. So again, back to Hermann. Hermann is one of the most significant figures to this retroactive narrative, a German patriot who won a great war over the Romans at the Teutoburgerwald. Cue analogy between Hermann and Varus and his legions to Bismarck and Napoleon III at the Battle of Sedan. In fact, Hermann was a tribal Cherusci chieftain, one of the various German tribes, and a former Roman auxiliary who betrayed Rome. And he spent as much time fighting Marbod, king of the Marcomanni tribe, as he did the Romans. You can say, and some have claimed, that this was the origin point of Arminius or Hermann wanting to establish a German kingdom from which to eventually drive out the Romans, but this never came to be. A comparison can be made between the brief Roman conquest of Germania, the regions between the rivers Rhine and Elbe, and the geography of the later kingdom of East Francia, which is claimed by some as one of these foundation dates for a German so-called nationhood. But what I'm doing there is to simply illustrate in your mind that it's not simply a coincidence, the fact that the Romans referred to Greater Germany, the region between the Rhine and the Elbe, in the same way that later people using Latin legal systems and Latin appellations and Latin constitutions will refer to the exact same territory by the exact same name. In terms of the inherited usage of these various words. Not to say that this word was all exclusive. You have various iterations of Germany across the Rhine, which the Romans use as well. And then you have territories like Raetia and Noricum, which make it even more complicated to use. Indeed, if you're thinking about inceptions of nationhood, if people bandy around saying 843 is the beginning of Germany, why don't you use the River Nine, which was the Battle of the Teutoburger Wald? The tribes, which are really important to talk about, are the Suebi, along the Elbe River more generally, and the Marcomanni, the Danube. These were the most prominent of the Germanic tribes. By Germanic tribes, we're talking about tribes that were distinct from their Latin and Celtic neighbors, tribes assumed to be cultural and linguistic predecessors to the so-called Western Germanic groups, who finally wrote down their languages in the post-migration period after the 6th century. Prior to then, the best sources we have are runic inscriptions. Notice how I say Western Germanic. The Goths and other sort of various groups et al. Are not considered part of the Western Germanic group and are now considered extinct, despite the Gothic Bible as a written record preceding a West Germanic written culture by several centuries. Indeed, what we can really understand from the East Germanic group is extrapolated from various documents, such as the, if I believe correctly, the Volifa Bible, the Great Gothic Bible, which is part of the reason why so many early Germanic kingdoms embraced Arianism, because it was an Arian Bible, not Aryan in terms of Aryan spelt with a Y, but spelt with an I, referring to Arius and his particular belief on the non-divinity of Christ. The Eastern Germanic group obviously has faced its demise, but West Germanic, yes, Walifa, it includes not just Germans, but the Dutch, the Flemish, Scandinavian countries, and the English. And of course, as the Suebi are the assumed progenitors of the Alemanni tribe, that is where we have the etymology again of Allemand in French. In the 5th century, the Western Roman Empire collapsed. Many of the countries of Europe today were built on the ruins of that empire, the Western Roman Empire, by tribes who crossed the Rhine. The Visigoths in Spain, the Langobards in Italy, the Anglo-Saxons in England, and the Franks in France. While the first two continue to use their Latin place names, the latter two did not. The tribes of the Angles lent their name to Angleland, England, and the Franks, Frankreich, France. What is more, the province name of Saxony remains. My point more generally is to demonstrate the centrality of the migration period to European history in general, and not just German history in the particular. The point alone severely complicates the view of a continuity of German history, which is geographically deterministic. Like I said, if we're referring to a geography which was determined as Germany, it was determined by the Romans between the rivers Rhine and the rivers Elbe. How, when most European countries are Germanic to a lesser or greater extent, can we have a conception of German history which is so determined around that single region? Within that scheme, the use of new place names becomes significant. Had the conquests of the Visigoths in Spain and the Langobards in Italy been more enduring, their names may have become more ubiquitous. Instead, the Langobard name is relegated to Lombardy, the region around their capital of Pavia, near modern-day Milan. The very use of the name England is a reminder of their connection to modern Germany through their suffix identity of Saxon, Anglo-Saxon. People are quick to comment that the modern region of Saxony is actually an ancient Thuringia. I would contest further that modern Saxony rests on much of the old borders of the Slavic Wends and the Sorbs, the Limes Sorabicus against the medieval borders of East Francia, which was roughly again the terminus of the old Roman province of Germany. By coincidence, it should also be known that Sorbs and various Slavic peoples still have that little pocket in Saxony today. Nevertheless, the Germanic connection between the two peoples still stands. If anything, the comparison is strengthened by the fact that both were tribes with a similar origin point in southern Jutland that came to occupy Brittonic and Slavic lands respectively. As you can see, there was a proliferation of nations formed around a Germanic identity, for lack of a better word, a tribal identity. For a moment, it was the Franks who dominated Europe, a people whose heartland was in the now dead nation of Austrasia. traversing the rivers Main, Meuse, and the Rhine itself. The Franks even contested their authority as a Christian nation against the Saxon pagans in the east, with the Franks under Charlemagne coming out on top, establishing an empire over the tribes up to the border with the Slavs at the river Elbe. Then this empire fragmented, and therein lies the problem. Very broadly, Austrasia was the nucleus of a Germanic empire, later the Carolingian Empire, to previously been the Merovingian Empire, both reflecting the dynasties that ruled over the Franks. Had the empire of Charlemagne not fragmented in 843, the majority of the Germanic patrimony would have remained united, with the exception of England and Scandinavia. Scandinavia is an interesting case. Obviously, it's the origin point of the quote-unquote Germanic peoples. If we're going to try and backdate this and find antecedents, is also the origin for the East Germanic and Gothic peoples as well, by that same metric. During the 6th, 7th, and the 8th centuries, they are known essentially as the great sort of Viking Norse warriors and pirates and raiders. They reached their heyday in the 10th century, which is actually after the division of this territory. So Scandinavia is still Norse and Viking at a time where the other Germanic nations were coalescing around a Christian identity, so as to further juxtapose the quote-unquote Germanic identities. But the overall division of the empire in 843 has major consequences for a continuity of German so-called nationhood in the modern sense, in which Alemann and Frankreich belong to the same political patrimony. Indeed, this has broader implications if you watch my video on the Holy Roman Empire, my recent video on the idea to kill a catacomb. Charlemagne was not a German emperor. Such a title was ridiculous. He was a Roman emperor who happened to be a Frank. One can say with far less conviction that Napoleon was not a French emperor, but a Roman emperor who happened to be Corsican. Sovereignty and modern notions of territorial integrity did not exist back then. Rome and Christianity were universal, and they were inseparable ideas. As Charlemagne was the Roman emperor, his claims of authority extended to the borders of the heathen Mohammedans in Al-Andalus, as he would refer to them as, the pagan Slavs over the river Elbe, in the Limes Sorabicus, and the Greek Orthodox Empire of the Greeks, which was a very derisive name for the Romaioi, or the Eastern Roman Empire, later Byzantine Empire across the Adriatic. And this had a further implied right of conquest over all of these territories, implied by the universal nature of the Christian empire, going back to the original conception under Constantine. The only theoretical limit to this authority was that of God's authority, and through God, bishops, most notably the Bishop of Rome, which we have a conflict which endures throughout most of the medieval period. Charlemagne's universality can and has been interpreted in many ways by both the Germans and the French as some sort of great sort of national antecedent again, like Hermann, to any Christian appealing to have the title of emperor with all the implications and authorities that assumes, up to his namesake, Karl, during the First World War of Austria-Hungary. And indeed, Charlemagne has also been taken as a progenitor for modern European integration, or the European Union, which is frankly absurd, but there we are. To refer to Charlemagne as a German Kaiser, and only a German Kaiser, as you would, say, for example, Frederick Wilhelm II, is to fatally misunderstand both Charlemagne and the medieval world by extension. So, when his empire divided, Charlemagne's, the partitions were all variations of Francia. Several were able to reunite, and they readopted the name Romans, while the remaining partition of the Franks separated from the empire to become France. The reformed Roman Empire contained within it a horde of tribes, among other Italians, Slavs, and so on. So the ethnographers of the 19th century set about to make sense of the tribes. They coined the word Stammesherzogtum, tribal duchies over the older Deutsche Völker, German nations. Before the 19th century, a case could be made that England, the Netherlands, Denmark, Sweden, Norway, Iceland, and to a lesser extent Switzerland, Belgium, and France, in that order, were embryonic Germanic nations. But to that list, you would also add Swabia, Frisia, Thuringia, Franconia, Ripuria, the Rhineland, Bavaria, Saxony, and the new tribes of Austria and Prussia. All of these had local traditions, legacies of shared legal systems of government, and, of course, language. By demoting these nations or realms to ducal tribes, or in English terms, stems, the historians of the later state of Germany were attempting to justify that these nations were components of the original it and had been part of the it for 1,000 years, a conglomeration of tribal communities as part of a German wholeness and distinct from the other Germanic nations. The reformed Roman Empire to which I'm referring to contained two of the three Frankias, the Middle and the East Francia. Though East Francia included a preponderance of Germanic tribes, it did not include the entire boundary of modern Germany, like I said, the Elbe being the traditional river boundary, or the Germans west of the Rhine, save for the region around the Palatinate. Ultimately, East Francia was just a dynastic division. There was no intention to establish a Germany for its own sake, only to settle the rivalries of the sons of Lothair I, following a ruinous pattern established by the Frankish Merovingians. Now the Carolingians were following suit and dividing their empire in partial succession. West Francia, which went on to become France, with its Gallic, its Flemish, Catalonian, and Occitan populations, was similarly heterogeneous to East Francia, while Middle Francia, including Italy and the Low Countries, was the most extreme amalgamation of heterogeneous populations, as you can probably imagine. Within the reformed Holy Roman Empire, there existed three kingdoms: Germany, Italy, and Burgundy, all of which were considered Germanic, while the Kingdom of Germany held the distinction of corresponding to those old Roman borders again between the Elbe and the Rhine that I mentioned earlier. The reason Italy would be referenced as Germanic is the fact that the Italians were conquered by the Langobards, and that is the kingdom that was conquered by Charlemagne to usher in the new Carolingian Empire. The Burgundians were also a Germanic tribe, but they more or less became completely and utterly assimilated with the local cultures, the local Gallican cultures that they encountered. Indeed, if you look at the sort of origins of Burgundy, Burgundy moves. In fact, I would refer to three Burgundies. One of the Burgundies is the Burgundy I'm referring to. It also is known as the Aralat, or the Kingdom of Arles, referring to its capital city in the medieval period. Another Burgundy is the Ducal Burgundy, which is part of the West Francia, or the Kingdom of France. And the third Burgundy actually refers to the realm which more or less encompassed the north of Middle Francia, Lotharingia, which is where we get the etymology of Lorraine. So, albeit it was considered originally a German tribal realm or tribal kingdom, it would ultimately begin to lose its Germanic identity as the cultures from below come to supersede it. Unlike what happened in Italy and Burgundy, that simply isn't the case within the Latin prescribed territories of Germany proper. Linguistically, there had occurred the High German consonant shift, which pertained to the tribes, the so-called dialect continuum, that could eventually foster the mutual intelligibility of the tribes within the Kingdom of Germany. Politically, the defining moment for East Frankish, German, and European history as a whole was when King Conrad and King Henry the Fowler were elected on the foundations of a realm that was separate, referring to the lesser kingdoms and the original stem duchies, yet also indivisible, a situation that would persist for East Francia in law, if not in political fact, all the way up until 1806. And this is a point that many were making regarding the continuity of a German nation state or whatever. It goes back to this, the legal foundations of East Francia. But like I said, from the point of view of the Etonians, this is simply a set stepping stone for which they could then move their base of authority in the 13th century, the Holy Roman Emperors, back into Italy. In the case of looking at someone like Frederick II, back to the city of Palermo. The principal point here is that essentially is comparative. Politically, the West Germanic group had divided. The Holy Roman Empire included the largest collection of German nationalities. The history of the Holy Roman Empire is to some extent a process of slow collapse or fragmentation. Middle Francia is perhaps the most blatant example of this because it fragmented within the lifetime of the first ruler to inherit it, Lothair II. But for East Francia, this collapse occurred with the Golden Bull of 1356, following the anarchies of the 13th and 14th centuries. The most obvious example of this political collapse was the collapse of the Duchy of Swabia itself. Swabia, one of these stem duchies, Swabia that was so important to the dynasty that ruled it, the Hohenstaufens, which became one of the most decentralized regions in Germany from the 13th century, to the point that political power would never really originate from that region ever again. And that again causes another crisis for Germany and the Holy Roman Empire. The Holy Roman Empire could have dissolved completely in the following years. Each of these aforementioned German nations could have emerged as their own distinct countries by today. This, the potential of collapse, I've always viewed as a possible, and some instances, the probable outcome up to the modern day. Consider this. From the 18th to the 20th centuries, there began a united patrimony of the English peoples. Now there are 5 Anglophone countries: America, Canada, Australia, New Zealand, and England, Great Britain itself, within which you have Anglophone countries, if not countries that refer to themselves as having an English root identity. I'm talking, of course, about Northern Ireland, Wales, and Scotland. I hate to say this, but the state-driven narrative of national history is fundamentally stymieing historical understanding, let alone creativity in understanding history. You only have to see the results of a thing and contrive some telos, a teleological understanding to arrive at the thing. Because the thing exists, thereby there had to be a predominating cause, or indeed a determined cause to arrive at said thing. Hence, changing the tribe's demonym from realms to stems, separate entities versus the roots of a tree of nationhood. And that to me is probably the most blatant example when I try and draw distinctions between the groups existing within the Roman province of Germany, which inherited that legal distinction, and looking at the diffusion of quote unquote Anglo nations, the 5 that I reference here. Why is it that Germany from the 9th century was destined to unite into this nation state? Why can't we say, for example, that the Anzac nations and Britain and America are also destined by this racial deterministic logic to unite together, given the fact that when these nations began to divide, they actually had more in common than the German tribes did of the 9th century in terms of their shared history, the length of that history, and the mutual intelligibility between the communities. Even to this day, American English isn't so distinct that it has become unintelligible, at least to people like me who probably spend too much time talking to and talking at Americans, if my YouTube analytics is anything to go by. Someone raised the point regarding my original application of the stem duchies. Until the demise of the Hohenstaufens, the 5 originally recognized were left as one in the end. There were 2 Frankish kingdoms, Franconia and Lotharingia, the latter belonging to Middle Francia. It wasn't even belonging to East Francia. And this is because, like I said, part of the imperial amalgamation meant that territories were added to this as the Ottonians came into power. There was, of course, Swabia, which I mentioned prominently. And to this list, people have considered Bavaria and Saxony to be variations of stems or new stems, albeit there's no consensus on that. Of all of these original stem duchies, only Bavaria remained as a politically distinct realm within the empire, and you can say that it has remained as a distinct realm within the empire up until modern Germany itself. My definition of the stems was more fluid, and I should have clarified that in the original video. It was a definition that included German speakers across a plethora of different divisions of the empire, rather than a strict usage that can only be realistically applied to Bavaria, that being a continuity of statehood and government. When I referred to Austria and Prussia, again, as these quote-unquote new tribes, I was referring to a fluid concept of the German Völker, the German nations. Austria evolved out of the Bavarian stem duchy, and Prussia was conquered by the Teutonic Order, its population annihilated, these being the original Prussian Balts, and a new duchy, the Prussians, The Prussian duchy was created outside the Holy Roman Empire, technically as a fief of the Polish king. But both Austria and Germany, in their original environs, were both undoubtedly German nations, and to deny that is to take the most legalistic and myopic view of German statehood as constituted exclusively within the medieval constitution of the Kingdom of Germany within the Holy Roman Empire. Again, I don't believe when I'm stating these rather controversial points that I'm going to get no pushback later in the comments. So whilst you're here and I'm barreling through these points again, I would implore you to ask any questions as I go through these points one by one. Point 8. Whereas the French description of Allemagne is historically congruent, in the Middle Ages, the French recognized the It as the domains under the rule of the Duke of Swabia, the Hohenstaufen dynasty of Roman emperors. The Swabians were the descendants of the Alemanni tribe. Therefore, the Swabians were to the It what the Franks were to France. Appropriately, the Norman French rulers adopted the same label which entered into standard English as Almani. When the German state came into existence in the 19th century, the French didn't bother to update their nomenclature. If they had, they may have derisively referred to the new entity as Preuss, indicating the domains under the lordship of the King of Prussia. The latter point was a subtle joke on my part, which I hope would have been more obvious, but what could have become a national joke of the French at the expense of this new German empire, that it was nothing more than an up-jump German contrivance of the Prussian minister-president and now Chancellor of Germany, Otto von Bismarck. A new Neue Schwabia, or Prussia meets the German Empire. The French description recognizes, more importantly, the feudal reality of power that emanated out of the Dukes of Swabia in the 13th century. The Hohenstaufens, the dynasty most intimately related to the imperial ideal. As for the Norman English of the use of the word Almani, I fail to further substantiate this point, as some commenters notice by embellishing it. As Almani fell out of use for English speakers, so this would have been around the 15th century, also around the time that the Duke of Swabia had no power and his duchy had demised, Dutch became the reference to both the Dutch in the modern sense and the Deutsche. A distinction between the two did not yet exist. Hence the reference to Pennsylvanian Dutch, German speakers in America. It was the political and economic power of the Dutch Republic, as distinct from the rest of Germany, which remained part of the Holy Roman Empire, that caused the English to separate the two terms, a fact that only became firmly established in English nomenclature in the 18th century. So by this time, the Dutch had risen and fallen as a great power. Note also that this confirms, rather funnily enough, given the fact it was simply a linguistic evolution, it also represented a legal fact for the English, because the Netherlands was officially part of the Holy Roman Empire until the conclusion of the 80 Years' War in 1648, the same year as the Peace of Westphalia. And again, all this does is further justify the English association as of the Dutch and the Deutsche as distinct from one another. But before then, when they were part of the same polity, the English didn't accept a distinction. They were all simply Dutch, even those who emigrated out to the New World and their new colonies. So where does Deutschland come from? It is a medieval variation of Celtic, the Celtic word for Teuton, another tribe which famously clashed with the Romans. By the 16th century, it came to resemble the German word of folk, meaning people. Again, which people? What defined the so-called tribal duchies in distinction to other Germanic peoples was their belonging to an entity, namely the Roman or Holy Roman Empire. That entity was the most decentralized state in Europe and contained many non-German speakers. Within the old patrimony of the Holy Roman Empire, there were over 30 major dialects in 1900, a century after that empire had ceased to exist. This is where it is relevant to bring in the Polish word of Niemcy, for Niemcy literally means mute, mute as an unintelligible to the Slavs. To the Polish, the entire German nationality is defined in the negative, to what they aren't, which are Slavic speakers. This point met with a lot of pushback, and some of it I will perfectly concede is justified because it relates to my etymology of the word Deutschland. I presented a variation of a root without the full connection to the resulting word Deutsche. The medieval variation begins in Latin as Theodiscus, or in the Old High German as Deutzig, and this in the vernacular language that emerges after the migration period, meaning popular or of the people, hence its German synonym in folk. Emphasis on the word variation. I didn't imply it to mean, albeit people could have come away with that interpretation, a strict derivation from the word or the Celtic rendering of Teuton to the word Deutsche. As the origins of the Teutons themselves were unclear, it is very possible that the same antecedents for Deutsche were used for the Celtic variation of the word Teuton from the same Indo-European root of Teuta, meaning tribe, which evolved into the Baltic languages as Tauta, meaning nation, and the Celtic Tuat, meaning tribe. Hence, Teutonic tribes can potentially mean, to refer to the Teutonic tribes can simply refer to the tribes, illustrating much of the confusion brought in by the various language groups to describe certain peoples without a literary tradition to identify themselves. This word even has an Old English equivalent in teda, again meaning that sort of popular thing or conglomeration or people, but of course it's fallen out of everyday language. The salient point, however, relating to my Polish example as an identity defined in the negative, is that the popular, or the people, arose to define a linguistically similar, yet not yet mutually intelligible, sect of inhabitants of the Latin-defined German kingdom. Inhabitants now spanning across political units and later religions with little to no loyalty to their supreme leader, the Holy Roman Emperor. References to the German kingdom and the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation have been made by various commenters. Nevertheless, again, it is reference to a strictly constitutional Latin reading of German history. Indeed, the latter description has been misconstrued, I believe. The references to a German nation were made during the height of the Reichsreform of Emperor Maximilian I. This was in the year 1512, so just before the Lutheran Reformation of 1517. It confirmed the political reality that within the Holy Roman Empire there existed a Germanic preponderance, not that the empire was a German nation-state, explaining the description's intermittent subsequent use. From there we can go on to have a more granular understanding of German consciousness in a universal sense. Following the Wendish Crusades and the Aussiedlung, the Germans settling just before the Black Death in the 14th century, from areas like Bohemia to the now sort of ubiquitous provinces that are now part of Poland, but used to be the German provinces of Silesia and Pomerania. Continuing onwards, you would encounter German speakers in the Baltic, in the Siebenbürgen, in Transylvania, Romania, and also Germans as far as Serbia, and they're referred to simply as Saxons. This, if anything, again, is indicative of why the root word we have in Finnish for the Germans is a reference to the Saxons. It's the exposure of these Eastern Germans coming out during the Aussiedlung, the Eastern settling. Consider the implications of the Eastern Germans across Europe and their consciousness of belonging to a German realm and a German Reich. These various Germans had inhabited these regions far beyond the Holy Roman Empire for centuries. Within the Holy Roman Empire in Bohemia, for example, the relationship between the Germans to the Czechs resulted in centuries of conflict, but this was a conflict that stemmed far beyond the simple distinction of an ethnicity. An argument has even been made by Erich von Kuhnhelt-Ledeen that the origins of modern National Socialism are to be found as some Germanic Czech extreme offshoot in Bohemia through an esoteric connection to Jan Hus and the Hussites, not to be found in modern Germany proper. Contrast that to the Hungarian Germans or to the Baltic Germans, whose loyalty to the local sovereign wasn't seriously questioned until 19th century and the rise of popular nationalism. Again, how are you supposed to construe all of these things? What makes these Germans any less German? than the Germans, who simply happened to inhabit the territories of the Holy Roman Empire within the old Roman established borders of Germany between the rivers Rhine and the Elbe. But by this time, that definition had come to include parts of Pomerania and Silesia, those parts that weren't still considered part of the Kingdom of Poland. The imperial court in Innsbruck, Austria, and the court of the electors of Saxony had patronized prestige dialects or chancery languages. With the Lutheran Reformation, High German was standardized into a vernacular language through the proliferation of Luther's Bible and the patronage of the Saxon court. That same Reformation brought about a religious schism and a religious war, one of the most horrific wars in German history. Prior to the 16th century, the empire had at least been united under an emperor and a faith. Against whatever linguistic striving there was to conceive of the Deutsche, the people, the state to which they still belonged existed now as a legal fact but a political fiction. As the Romanness of the empire receded, and as the religious wars spawned religious skepticism, Germanness came to fill a spiritual void for a longing for political unity, underscoring a potential for revolutionary upheaval. Again, for latecomers coming in, I would suggest that if you have a question pertaining to any of these reading segments, as I go through them one by one, preface a point in the comment section at Apostolic Majesty, and I will try to respond to you as I'm responding to these points in general. In that single segment, I have condensed a seismic political shift to illustrate an overall concise argument, or at least what I believe to be concise. With the original video and my further elaborations, you can hopefully see that there was a growing linguistic unity within the empire to offset the earlier political fragmentation of the interregnum. By this time, we're seeing hundreds of little German principalities emerge. The political corollary to this was the Reichsreform of Maximilian I from his court in Innsbruck, modern-day Austria. The Lutheran Reformation was as much a revolt of the princes as it was a religious revolution aimed at the Catholic emperor and the Catholic pope. The partial success of the Reformation served to further destabilize the region of Germany and to rob the Holy Roman Empire of its raison d'etre, its core of universality, its very purpose. I referenced earlier the loss of West Francia to France, but the imperial cause was still strong in the 13th century. The Reformation occurred during one of these new imperial restorations, and by imperial restoration, I'm referring to the Habsburg Restoration. The Habsburgs had come to power off the back of Emperor Sigismund. Again, one of these great reforming emperors in the 15th century with rather heterodox religious ideas, who happened to be king of Hungary and Bohemia. But through the emperors Frederick III, Maximilian I, and Charles V, there is a imperial restoration. And like we saw with the Hohenstaufens and their power base in southern Italy, the power base of the Habsburgs was only partly within the whole concept of the quote-unquote Germanic tribes, that being Austria. Otherwise, we have to talk about the Low Countries, Eastern France, Spain, and later, again, Bohemia and Hungary. All of these things which actually help to establish a sense of juxtaposition between the emperor ruling all these lands on the periphery of the empire he nominally rules, which happens to have a German preponderance. The resolution of this struggle between the German Catholic emperor and the Protestant princes of the empire resulted in the so-called German liberty. And the German liberty allowed the princes of the German Empire, virtually independent now from the emperor, to have the rights of the 1356 bull confirmed, that essentially being their rights to virtual independence. But now those rights were elevated by a new right, the right of the ruler to determine the religion of his subjects, Caius regio, eius religio, to the ruler, the state, the religion. To those who think, again, that race and national belonging, relatively modern concepts, were paramount concerns to a people living through an epistemic crisis, Catholicism versus Protestantism, you'll have to wait a couple of centuries. The crisis and the failure of a resolution to this following the cataclysm of the 30 Years' War, which further cemented the quote-unquote German liberty of the princes of the empire, this time no longer just Lutherans, but also legally established Calvinist rulers, established the political and intellectual spiritual environment for the thinkers of the 18th century to look beyond religion, to find belonging in a new sense of the transcendent, the nation of Germany. You can say that this forms part of the new humanities of German intellectualism, what sort of later evolves into elements of German idealism, Hegelianism. I actually mentioned phenomenology earlier with Herzl, but also talking about Marxism, and of course, Marxian analysis is actually quite has a point here, I believe, and I'll get into that in a moment. But as for Germany, this relates back to my point where I was talking about the catacomb, the fact that the Holy Roman Empire was an eschatological state. The existence of the Holy Roman Empire meant the endurance of God's realm, the vice-regency of Christ on earth. And the Holy Roman Empire had now failed because it allowed for a profusion of religious difference within the Holy Roman Empire. If the empire wasn't universal, in the sense that it represented a claim to all of the world in terms of temporal authority, but it wasn't also universal in the sense that it was Catholic in terms of religion, then the empire had failed. And moreover, from the point of view of people looking at the Holy Roman Empire, God had failed to protect the Holy Roman Empire. So looking from this and looking beyond this point of view of the Holy Roman Empire, now it essentially failed in the 16th century, there is the prospect that perhaps a united folk, a national community, could preserve a Germany, at least, from the threat of foreign invasion. This is something you really get across in writers such as Schiller. When you look at the 30 Years' War, the devastation caused by the Danish and far more prominently the Swedish interventions is something equivalent to what you see in Poland around the same time with the deluge, which is the occupation of much of the country by the Russians and the Swedes. Is this notion that the German states are not powerful enough to protect themselves, and they have to fall back on some other self-conception, some other authority which will allow essentially for there to be stability and peace, and simply not the cause of such death on a seemingly sort of insurmountable scale. Some of these regions in Germany were utterly decimated in terms of their populations. I don't tend to put too much stock in relations in terms of the historical accounting of death figures, but across the 30 Years' War, it's estimated that as many as 10 million people could have been killed, and most of them civilians brought as a result to death by the cause of the privations of war. This is part of the reason why there is, you can say, some satisfaction in looking at Prussia and Prussian statehood as the solution to this, rather than looking at broader national German identity. Because Brandenburg was one of the most devastated regions, the core of the Kingdom of Prussia, as a result of the interventions, in particular the Austrians and the Swedish. And nevertheless, the great elector during the course of the later 17th century is able to build the foundations of a modern European state with one of the most advanced armies in the world, something that will be taken over by his relatively capable successors, Frederick I, first King of Prussia, Frederick Wilhelm I, and the incredibly famous Frederick II the Great. The success of Prussia in terms of being able to counter the sense of German privation and German loss is such that German identity became that of a German dualism between the Austrians having nominal headship over the empire and Prussia essentially having that relationship where they could preserve the rights of the other German princes, as was demonstrated during the War of Bavarian Succession, I believe, in the 1770s. So if you look at that and you look at Prussia as essentially a German solution to a German problem, you can understand why certain historians of the 19th and early 20th centuries would like to see a continuity of Germanness through the prism of the state of Prussia itself as emerging from the ruins of the 30 Years' War. This concept of national renewal will now permeate so much of the logic of a German historical narrative going forward. The Germanic nations still existed. Bavaria and Saxony being coherent examples of those original tribal duchies, though the latter's geography had changed. The leading Germanic state, Austria, was not a Germanic nation at all, but a dynastic state, whose stem, Austria, was given to an empire which was an overwhelmingly non-Germanic state. Just to add a little bit of embellishment in there from the original script. Again, to illustrate, Bavaria is really the only cogent example following on from a very strict definition of what it means to be a stem duchy within the empire. One can say that the true Saxon stem is perhaps better illustrated by the electorate of Hanover than the titular electorate of Saxony because of its geography. But my use of the stem for Austria can be contested, as I stated earlier, with my very fluid definitions. But as for Austria, before the Emperor Francis II dissolved the Holy Roman Empire on his own volition in 1806, he declared himself Emperor of the Empire of Austria. He was not Emperor of the Austrians, and the Austrians weren't a reference to the German-speaking Austrians. It was just a reference to the House of Austria, the Habsburgs. Francis ruled over modern Czechia, Slovakia, Hungary, Austria, Slovenia, Croatia, in addition to parts of Italy, Poland, Romania, Ukraine, and Serbia, hence the dynastic state. The Austrians were simultaneously the most powerful of the German states and the least German of the German states, a conundrum that would not be solved by German nationalists until Bismarck, and even then Bismarck's solution was a half measure to many. Within Austria and within Russia, the Slavs, who simply refer to the Germanic peoples as the mutes, conceived of their own system of ethnic and linguistic unity, panslavism. Panslavism was either a cynical tool of the Russian Tsar or a democratic movement to topple regimes everywhere and unite all the Slavic peoples from Russia to Slovenia. The logic for the German speakers was the same. Interesting enough, again, I'm not going to sort of belabor some of the comments too much. If you've seen the comment section on that video, you'll see why. But someone seemed to imply, again, maybe it's trying to read an intention into these words, or assuming essentially that a tone or a way of delivery is indicative of some sinister point. But when I was referring to Panslavism and the utilization of a cynical tool, you can say Bismarck was just as cynical in terms of his use of German nationalism, and I believe that's the case. But somehow someone took away that notion that me believing it was used by some as a cynical tool means that it in totality amounted to nothing more than a cynical tool, which has not given me any benefit of the doubt, but regardless. But here, comparing German nationalism to other iterations of nationalism is pertinent. Other commenters have been quick to point out the connection between Germany to France, but in my view, this Slavophilia or Panslavism is a better comparison. The irony of that for those who construe the 20th century as an ethnic struggle between the Germanics and the Slavs notwithstanding. French nationalism, to vastly oversimplify, shares many traits with German nationalism, which I'll get to in a moment. However, both German and Slavic nationalism deal with the same question of uniting a vast ethnic cohort across multiple states, with the lingering question of which should be the leading state, or whether there should be a leading state at all, that the national revolution should be undertaken completely from below. The leading states were for a time assumed to be the states of Prussia and Russia, respectively, for the Germans and the Slavs. But despite that, Pan-Slavism's intellectual origins can be found in Croatia and the First Pan-Slavic Conference in 1848 in Bohemia, within the Austrian Empire, not the Russian Empire. For the French, there was only the Gallican French state, with a small Walloon and Swiss population across its borders. Their territorial designs of French nationalism were directed at completing the foreign policy goals of Louis XIV. In other words, French nationalism from the outset had a far more democratic connotation to it because it was simply a matter of overthrowing the hated Frankish kings and assuming the Gallican qualities of a new national character that would expand its borders to the quote-unquote natural territories, which were assumed to be the left bank of the Rhine, including all of Belgium, some of the Netherlands, and a section of modern-day Germany. But again, this is rather interesting to consider because I don't believe, therefore, that Germany and the Slavic identity in general can be compared. Of the various etymologies of Slav, two are the sort of most popular. One is from Slava, meaning victory, and the other is Slovo, meaning those who speak. And I find Slovo is that sort of interesting contrast between the Polish word "niemcy," which means that the Germans are mute. We Slavic speakers are those who speak, and you are the ones who are effectively unintelligible to us, because it's the mutual intelligibility of the Slavic languages that lends itself essentially to this ideology of uniting all the language speakers. But the minute you begin to think about it, you have to cross some serious hurdles. Croatia and Serbia linguistically are very, very similar, to the point that some don't even draw the distinction between the languages and simply refer to it as uh, Croatian Serbian or Serbo-Croatian or whatever iteration of that. But if you look at the history of the two regions, not only are they historically distinct, but I believe they essentially belong to two different historical universes. One being the Holy Roman Catholic German identity in the West, and the other being the Orthodox Roman and later Ottoman identity in the East. And so, can the question of language absolve the various historical differences that have kept these two nations, Croatia and Serbia, apart? If you look at the success or lack of success of Yugoslavia, that question has since been determined. No. So it's very possible, again, that following from the same logic that built Czechoslovakia and Yugoslavia, and at one point sought to unite peoples who, again, seem to be the greatest historical enemies, Poland and Russia, into one continuous state. The same logic or the same pitfalls will befall anyone who is thinking about a united German identity. And the greatest pitfalls, of course, is the fact that you have the division between essentially North and South, the Catholic German identity, which also, in terms of the dialect of the Austro-German and low and high and all those distinctions, comes into contrast with the Protestant identity in the north. In order to do something as far-fetched as unite the Serbian and Croatian identities, you're going to need to overcome those same differences, which are apparent within Germany itself. This is where Prussia has a massive advantage. Prussia had an advantage in the sense that it was already a German state before it united Germany. As a result of the Napoleonic Wars, Germany was reassembled and repartitioned, and Prussia received less territories in Poland, but a much larger German contingent in Westphalia in the Rhineland. And this then becomes the engine for the Prussian industrialization and war machine. The significance of that is something, again, that wouldn't be lost on the Social Democrats in the 1920s who were trying to hold the Weimar Republic together, is the fact that of all the states that seemed geographically determined to produce a outcome of unity, it seemed that Prussia was the natural choice, because unlike all these various stem duchies, it began as a offshoot of Germanness surrounded by the Poles in the east. Then it became attached to the political ambitions of the dynasty coming out of Brandenburg, the Hohenzollern dynasty. Then it became united into a continuous realm under Frederick II. And then during the beginning of the 19th century, following on from the Napoleonic Wars, we have a new, almost pan-German identity, which can't really be ascribed to any one tribe. Indeed, when I was going over my assessment of the execution of Prussia as a nation, the references were always to East Elbe, east of the Elbe, the German identity, which was founded on this hierarchical conception of agrarianism and the service nobility, Junkerism. So it seems again rather remarkable that if we're coming to a Prussian identity, it's actually the identity which is beyond the old Roman borders. It's on the frontier. It's civilization which is bordering on with the Slavic populations, especially given the large number of Poles who are now part of Prussia. An even larger part, it should be mentioned, who are part of Prussia during the 18th century. But then again, there's the question whether there should be a leading state at all. The reason Russia and Prussia seem so obvious examples, I've already listed why Prussia seemed to be the obvious example to lead Germany. For Russia, it was simply the case that they were not just a Slavic empire, but they were a world empire. Towards the end of the existence of the Russian Empire, they held a continuous state which encompassed a sixth of the surface of the earth, the land surface of the earth. if any state was going to unite the Slavs, it would rely on the Russians to destroy the Austrian Empire, to destroy the Ottoman Empire, to break apart and reforge these units. Such were some of the suggestions as a result of the Russian potential gains from the First World War before the Russian Revolution, revolving around linking with Serbia, Bulgaria, but more prominently about establishing the Russian Tsar as the king of Bohemia and all of these other things, expanding his realm of Poland at the expense of Germany and Austria. But this robs it of its democratic quality or nationhood, and this again is a pivotal point to understand the whole notion of German nationality. So getting to the third point, creating the it as a small Germany without the multi-ethnic Austrians, as a greater Germany with the multi-ethnic Austrians, or as misspelt greater, I do apologize, or a greater Germanic entity, including all of those Germanic nations. I have to attack my sort of my Word document for that because it shouldn't have missed that. But anyway, one can call this a process of creating Germany or recreating Germany. And this is why it's important to label Germany as having gradations of existence and different types of existence throughout its history, a fluid and evolving concept of national realization. As for this, I lean towards the argument that all realistic projections of a united Germany in the 19th century were recreations. By that, I mean recreations of the Holy Roman Empire of the German nation, but now with the German part of it taking preeminence over the Holy Roman part of it, thereby rendering it a nonsense, to be quite frank. In 1848, the Greater German solution was attempted by appealing to the then borders of the German Confederation, which roughly resembled the Holy Roman Empires at the point of its dissolution. So appealing to those old imperial borders, which it should be noted didn't include large segments of Austria or even Prussia east of the Elbe. The German revolutionaries even proclaimed a Habsburg imperial regent, who I've done an entire video on, Regent Johann, and offered the throne over united Germany to the King of Prussia, who was then Frederick Wilhelm IV. It could have been that, mimicking the fate of the old Holy Roman Empire, this greater German solution could have disintegrated shortly afterwards. In fact, if you say that this was an earnest attempt to create a German nationhood and such a thing was created, then indeed, like the Holy Roman Empire, it disintegrated shortly afterwards, and it simply relapsed into being the loose confederation it was before, which wasn't really even a confederation. It was more just a legal entity, if nothing else, which was the German Confederation. Before the ascendancy of Prussian Otto von Bismarck, and following the unification of Italy, indeed, it was assumed that Franz Joseph of Austria could have become the first Kaiser of a modern Germany. Such a Germany would have resembled the Holy Roman Empire more closely as a confederation of princes. The small Germany, or Kaiserreich, was the domination of these lesser German princes by the King of Prussia. It should also be noted by the annexing of many German principalities, the most controversial and notable being the Kingdom of Hanover, but also the exclusion of Austria, no longer making Austria part of a German wholeness. Thus, in this instance, when Germany was finally united, quote unquote, the Prussian monarchy had supplanted or usurped the role of the Habsburgs within the Holy Roman Empire, while enshrining the multi-confessional nature of it, which had been established from the Lutheran Reformation. To illustrate this, the Prussian king himself represented a state church that was a union of Calvinist and Lutheran denominations. Indeed, you can take this further and say that a more grandiose aspect of Bismarck's project was to de-Catholicize the new Germany, to prevent any residual idea that the Austrians could pit the various mainly Catholic princes against the Prussians. That's an interesting argument. It certainly doesn't apply universally. It certainly applies within Prussia itself. The Kulturkampf was strongest in the areas where it failed most cataclysmically, which is in the Rhineland and Westphalia, regions which I mentioned earlier, regions which were also the least Prussian and the most Catholic. But in the case of states like Bavaria, Bismarck could do virtually nothing to it. Bavaria, as it is today, is that maverick within Germany. It remains that united, cohesive identity, even though Bavaria of the 19th century now included regions that were beyond Bavaria, as I think some people commented in the section, in that modern Bavaria is in fact an amalgamation of parts of Swabia and parts of Franconia. That old stem duchy going all the way back from the beginning, this would be the sort of residual territories among the Main cities like Bayreuth and Bamberg, which were conceded to Bavaria after the Napoleonic Wars because Bavaria had temporarily gained the Tyrol and then given it back to Austria. So the Austrians, being very magnanimous in their victory of the Bavarians, gave them these vast territories in Franconia. But that is to say that if the cultural camp had been a complete success, we could have seen the final triumph of the Lutheran Reformation, but alas, the stalemate between Catholics and Protestants continued, and the Catholics found political action beyond their adherence to the local principalities by forming the party of the Centre or Zentrum, which then goes off to become a key component in the CDU, or the Christian Democratic Union, which is the leading member of the current coalition that's governing Germany today, albeit to say the CDU bears any similarity with the original sort of proto-creation in Zentrum is quite frankly ridiculous, to the point I really shouldn't even be bothering to mention it. Whatever the Deutsche, the people were, was in a state of flux, with the rationale for unity tempered by political realities. The third proposal, that being a very greater Germanic solution, only became a serious consideration in the 1930s. The logic for German recreation followed the political ambitions of the leading states in Germany, and was considered German. What was considered German was defined rather arbitrarily, now that the Austrians were no longer constituting Germans as belonging to a German nation state. If you read certain sort of antecedents towards Hitlerism, such as Schönerer against the Karl sort of Lueger Catholic socials in Austria at the beginning of the 20th centuries, then you understand that in order for there to be a German consciousness as concreted against the Austrian dynastic state, there was even the suggestion that the Germans within Austria had to wholesale go over and become Protestants in order to assimilate into the new Germany. But again, this is a perversion of the religious system in the sense that, like I said, during the 17th and the 16th centuries, the religious factor was all-encompassing and superseded the factor of national belonging or national community. But in this bizarre inverted twist of fate, by the 20th century, the religious factor was something to cement the national consciousness or national state of belonging, hence exhibited by the Austrians, who believed they would become more German by converting to Protestantism, to be more akin to the Prussians. So take this and expand. Yes, someone is rather adroitly mentioning in the chat, Jambet Sunni governing seems somewhat inapposite to the present German political situation, and I couldn't agree more with that. Not even presiding, I think, is a word that can be prescribed for the current situation in Germany. Expand the notion of German or Germanic, and you arrive first at the Saxon populations who were settled throughout the Austrian Empire, who I've already alluded to, such as the Siebenbürg and Saxony, and the Hungarian Germans, and the Slovakian Germans, the Croatian Germans, and of course the Bohemian Germans being the most prominent outside of Austria itself. And then you come to the central Polish Germans in the so-called Congress Poland, the Baltic Germans. These areas have been annexed to Russia in the Great Northern War of the 1710s. And of course, the Ukrainian and Volga Germans within the Russian Empire. And finally, expand to that this idea of all the West Germanic nations within Europe and beyond, and you arrive at the proposal of a greater German Reich, which was touted during the Second World War, because the logic is the same. The Volga Germans and the Ukrainian Germans had, again, that links to a certain Germanic wholeness, going back to when they were essentially imported or encouraged to emigrate by Catherine the Great in the middle of the 18th century. By that logic, the Volga Germans are, just as German as the Americans are English, in terms of the distance separating them and in terms of the length separating them. So if one were to unite the entire English patrimony, the same, say, for example, would exist for the Volga Germans. But by extension, the whole point of this is not only uniting these groups, but groups which are only somewhat mutually intelligible and only becoming so as a result of the education reforms in Germany in the 19th century. You have to go further and say, well, the Dutch are very close to us, so they would be the next extension of that aspect of German unification. If the Germans were seriously going about that way in the Second World War, then the actions of Arthur Seyss-Inquart and the Reichskommissariat there did everything to antagonize the Dutch populations. Yet at the same time, you have Wallonian collaboration with Rexism and Leon de Grelle and Groer and the Nordfrankreich and all of these things. It's possible if the situation in the Second World War developed to Germany's advantage, that all of these things, these logical consequences of uniting all of the Germanics and the whole logic for expansion would culminate in this grand West Germanic unification, the Greater Reich proposal. And indeed, I was talking about the whole distinction between recreation and creation. If you're going to look at this as a recreation, you would need to be recreating the conditions of the migration period during the 5th and the 6th centuries. However, this is a migration period where there is a single nation state which is conquering and assimilating all of the other Germanic realms. And this would constitute a German creation, obviously, rather than the simple recreation, because no such thing can even be considered to have existed even during the time of Charlemagne, where that distinction between the Scandinavian and the English countries versus the continental Germanics existed. Nevertheless, during the 1840s, the justification for the continued existence of separate German nations within the It, such as Bavaria and Saxony, was seen as a justification for the continuation of a hierarchical social order, an order where petty German princelings were suffocated by the young German nation suffocating the young German nation in its crib, a German nation led by democratic forces under the vanguard of the middle classes. Such was the logic of creating a Germany. It was the German state of Prussia who subverted this idea by wedding the new state or German Empire, Kaiserreich, to the logic that existed for it during the Middle Ages and the empire under the rule of the King of Prussia rather than the Duke of Swabia. I referenced earlier the logic behind three conceptions of Germany. Prussia, in order to maintain the social order, then allow itself to be destroyed by the revolutionaries, affected the small German solution. I've illustrated the points alluding to this German incarnation and German existence to make flesh. First was territorial and legal, as in their belonging to East Francia, belonging to the Holy Roman Empire when the Ottonians amalgamated it. The linguistic, how best to describe it? The linguistic similarities after the High German consonant shift in the 6th century, and the patronage later of the Chancery languages, a written German vernacular, albeit these had two sources, as I mentioned, Saxony and Innsbruck in Austria during the 16th century. But this Holy Roman Empire was heavily stratified, and the Reformation has major implications for this going forward. The Holy Roman Empire was divided among great secular rulers, princes, electors, and no kings. Kings was a title that was essentially imposed by Napoleon in order to aggrandize his allies. Princes of the church, the most prominent being the three ecclesiastical electors within Germany from the cities of Mainz, Trier, and Cologne. Princes of the church in the sense that they were almost invariably always cardinals. The imperial knights, who held little pocket territories throughout Germany, and the various limited republics of the Hanseatic League. There's also a so-called peasant republic existing in Dietmarschen, which is north of Hamburg. And speaking of Hamburg, the free and the imperial cities more generally, these were cities with their own civil constitutions who owed no allegiance to a particular lord. Rather, if there was to be a settlement or an arbitration between a city and its government in terms of internal arbitration, or between another authority within the Holy Roman Empire, such as a bishop or a prince, it had imperial immediacy. the imperial cities were connected to the emperor. The Lutheran Revolution pitted the more powerful of these secular princes, such as the princes of Saxony and the Landgrave of Hesse, against the religious establishment within the empire, and eventually against the lower orders. And I'm referring here to the Protestants' crushing of the Peasants' Rebellion, which was fully endorsed by Luther, if you find his various political treatise on crushing the rebellious and uh, ungrateful peasant stock. But the final victory of the German princelings came in the last years of the Holy Roman Empire's existence, when the mediatizations seized the remaining church territories in the empire and gifted them to the princes in compensation for the losses they had incurred at the hands of Napoleonic France. So throughout the process of, you can say, the demise of the Holy Roman Empire, first it is represented by that decentralization of authority, the fact that the Holy Roman Emperor is nothing more than a fiction in terms of the actual political makeup of the rest of the empire. The worst example of this was in the 18th century, when the King of Prussia, Frederick II, was essentially the guarantor of the German liberty, quote unquote, against the extensions of the Holy Roman Emperor himself to expand into his own empire. This being the fact that Joseph II wanted to give away modern-day Belgium in order to annex Bavaria, which from a point of view of trying to extend more power into Germany makes complete sense. But the fact that Frederick II was able to frustrate those plans, unite a league of the German princes in opposition, again shows how much of a nonsense the imperial authority really was. But again, it's also to demonstrate the fact that the whole ecclesiastical superstructure of the Holy Roman Empire, what made it holy, had also vanished. The fact that their territories could be so easily picked off in the final decades of the 18th and the first decade of the 19th century, that all of these secular princes could be given these territories as, quote, compensation. So the end of the Holy Roman Empire and the beginning of later the Rhine Confederation and German Confederation that follows the fall of Napoleon is a victory of the secular German princes. Indeed, what is remarkable about these German princes is that many of them joined Napoleon in carving up these territories, the Elector of Bavaria being the most prominent example, and then switched sides and were able to enlarge their territories. Again, the King of Bavaria being the most notable example. So many princes did very well out of the Napoleonic War, and many of them, Württemberg, Saxony, and Bavaria, got kingly titles as a result of it as well, as ridiculous as that may sound. But going back to the whole idea of the free and imperial cities and those city governments, what distinguishes a group known as the Bürgerliche in its medieval sense from the bourgeoisie in its 19th century sense, even Marxian sense, is a consolidation of a universal class consciousness across an entire nation state or purported nation state, vis-a-vis a very specific branch of urban dwelling notables localized to certain cities, these being the imperial and free cities. That's what it really means to have a stratified political structure within the Holy Roman Empire. Each local constitution was in many ways unique, its own political power reflecting again the whole nature of the makeup, or whether it be an ecclesiastical, a republic, or a princely form of government. But now take this notion of a Bürgerliche and apply it to this conception of a German state. I alluded to in this segment the whole notion of the democratic impetus towards Germany. To this bourgeoisie, who are now universalized as a result partly to the exposure of the French Revolution, but also due to the free access of information, travel links, the profusion of knowledge and literature, and burgeoning industrialization, the German princes were now the dam preventing their own economic and political advancement, that being the bourgeoisie. Certain measures have been taken to ameliorate this friction, this economic and class friction, such as the creation of the Zollverein, the customs union of many German states, but this was ultimately insufficient because this still denied power to the bourgeoisie, who had to remain entrapped within these princely forms of government. It is this fact that most of all, that illustrates the death of the Holy Roman Empire and its decentralized nature, and why the conception of liberal Germany in its purest form was an act of creation, not recreation. It's the destruction of everything that made the Holy Roman Empire distinctive. this blending together of all of these overlapping and corresponding hierarchical authorities. And you can say the genius of the Holy Roman Empire is just that, the patch quilt. But this liberal Germany, this is not the preservation of East Francia as it was in the 10th century, as separate duchies, but an indivisible monarchy. This Germany was a unitary democratic state, if not a democratic republic. This is where comparisons can be made between France and Germany from the period of France 1789 to 1793, with the execution of King Louis XVI. But what distinguishes France from Germany is that the bourgeoisie were less successful, and they were subverted by Bismarck and Bismarck's Prussia. And some commenters here were, I think, confused by the use of my language, specifically when I referred to an order where petty German princelings were suffocating the young German nation in its crib. Again, when I state such things, it should be obvious, unless you're sort of a newcomer who isn't going to give me the benefit of the doubt, that I explain views and I paraphrase views. I don't justify views if I'm talking like that. And what I was doing there was paraphrasing a view commonly held by the quote unquote young Germans, or if you're an American, the generation of 48. The growing animosity between Germany and England before the Great War catalyzed this exclusively German identity as opposed to a German community of nations. Serious efforts were made to establish a German identity from above through the standardization of the German language and the implementation of a German alphabet, the Schrift in 1915. Now, I do have to ask, surely given the amount of pushback I received on the original video, I can't believe that everyone is contented that my explanations are faultless in this regard. Surely someone has a question to ask me. Otherwise, I'm going to have to call an end to this stream prematurely. Obviously, I can forgive some of you who aren't here to be able to catch this live, but nevertheless, if I get any comments about this, I will be a little bit frustrated. There's no way I'm coming back and revisiting this topic for a third time. But as to this specific segment, this will form hopefully part of a conversation that I'm planning to host soon on Anglo-German relations during this period. And to put it simply, an expectation existed dating from the Austrian and later Prussian alliances with England, the alliance, it should be mentioned, that won the Battle of Waterloo against Napoleon, that the Germanic nature of the states established a logic for a natural alliance, a natural allegiance between the various polities. I think, again, to German policymakers who took that seriously, Denmark became a hostile nation as a result of the Second Schleswig-Holstein War in the 1860s. It appealed to the Danes, appealed to the British to intervene. They did not, perhaps thankfully, but nevertheless, the sundering of so much what is now Danish territory to the German Empire in Schleswig was a cause of severe animosity. And the other major Scandinavian state at the time, Sweden, Norway, pursued a historic policy of neutrality, one that would continue and endure throughout the First and Second World Wars. When Norway became its own country, obviously that didn't apply to Norway. But there's also this logic that because the English were neutral during the Franco-Prussian War under Gladstone, that the English would at least give the Germans a free hand in dealing with issues of the continent. But now add to that the policy of Weltpolitik and the German naval arms build-up and the dreadnought race in 1906 onwards. And all this does is help engender the exact opposite sentiment among the English, that there is a natural antipathy between Germany as dominating the continent and the threat that the high seas fleet concentrated around Wilhelmshaven in the North Sea could pose to the mainland. Again, as to the logic behind that's a topic for a different time, but it pertains to the language issue. I also love it, chat, that after I suggested, I was imploring you to ask me questions while you have me here and you have me captive, that there hasn't been a single comment since then. Every time I ask you to do something, you become more resolute and in remaining mute. You are as to me as what the Poles are to the Germans. You are you are Nimsi, you are mute, you are unintelligible to me, so get your act together. So as for the language issue, what I really meant to highlight here is that in the process of uniting a German nation and folk, it comes to exclude all the other Germanic nations. And this is epitomized through the adoption of the Schrift being the most obvious example. Um, but a commenter observed that this point needed further contextualization, and I agree fully. Suterlin literally means script, and it was an iteration of Kurrent, which is the German cursive or German cursive style. You can find non-standardized examples of German cursive from hundreds of years ago, alongside the Latin script, which is commonly used, which is Fraktur. But what distinguishes the Suterlin Schrift from these earlier scripts or Kurrent is that it was a standardized attempt to replace the Latin script from 1911 onwards at a time when Anglo-German relations were bordering on hostile. This is after the Morocco crisis. This is after the Agadir crisis, where David Lloyd George, who was then Chancellor of the Exchequer, was engaging in his tirades against Germany, and Germany was a menace and all that sort of thing. Absolute Majesty, have you read Restoration of Political Silence by Ludwig von Haller? His theory on the right of rulers to govern and his repudiation of popular sovereignty are pertinent. Yes, Carl Ludwig von Haller is one of these writers who I am aware of, but have not gotten around to reading yet. Yeah, especially as if I believe, correctly, him coming at this from a Swiss point of view. The author who I was going to actually focus on potentially tomorrow, but my timing schedule unfortunately frustrated it, was an English writer, Christopher Dawson. But all of these notions about the relationship between sovereignty and divinely sanctioned forms of government and community and the nation state, all of these things, they can be elaborated ad nauseum. What I like about history is that I'm able to concrete these examples, these ontologies, these categories into, you can say, realities existing in time, which is part of a series of other conversations that I want to have. But thank you for your question. Even though it's not particularly relevant to Suterlin Schrifts, I will answer it nevertheless. So just to illustrate that point, the whole standardization of a earlier form of German cursive to be used universally in the German education system is solidified in 1915 after the declaration of war on Germany. Again, the point is, we had a Germanic conception of natural alliances. Now we're going to draw a line in the sand and say, kind of like with the earlier High German consonant shift, we are German, you are no longer part of Germany, especially as we're talking about the alliance of the Austrians and the Germans and the wars between the French and the Slavs and the English against Germany and Austria. It seemed to encompass an all-encompassing attack on this Germanic identity foisted around the old Holy Roman Empire. And so adopting the standardized form of a German cursive style, which wasn't based on the Latin alphabet, would only seem to confirm that. However, it is curious that one certain Austro-Bavarian painter would revert to the Latin script in 1941, and I would hazard to say that this leads nicely to my next point. Nevertheless, the German alliance with Austria-Hungary helped concrete this budding German entity within a set of geographical boundaries that had excluded Austria and maintained the primacy of Prussia, these being the borders of the Kaiserreich and the Austro-Hungarian empires in alliance as opposed to claiming each other's territory. After the Great War, there was no historical boundary and alliances to contain the new Germany. The Greater Germany could and was achieved through the Anschluss with the Austrian Germans. Thereafter, the notion of Germanness became more indeterminate, the goal of uniting all the speakers who are more or less mutually intelligible, as the different dialects still and to this day remain, To settle this issue, the Reich attempted to abolish the old tribal identity that existed within Germany. Indeed, my belief is that this logic of uniting German speakers while eliminating the differences between the speakers would have necessitated a greater Germanic entity state, dependent of course on a favorable outcome for Germany in the Second World War. What is ironic about the use or the misuse of the Third Reich epithet by the National Socialists is that this described what was the triumph of the created Germany over the recreated Germany. For people who have no idea what I'm talking about, the Third Reich was meant to illustrate continuity with the two predecessor governments, the First Reich being the Holy Roman Empire, and the Second Reich being the Wilhelmine Kaiserreich, the Prussian Bismarckian Wilhelmine Kaiserreich. But again, it's just to illustrate that as a retroactive identity, it muddles and destroys the whole raison d'etre of the Holy Roman Empire. And again, it muddles the intentions behind the creation of the Bismarckian Kaiserreich in general. Apostolic Majesty from Matthew N2. I'm a little late to your stream, but what was the strongest political or cultural statement of the grassroots that showed German English kingship? You're going to have to elaborate because that question is a bit too general, too vague. I can't really emphasize what aspect of German English kingship. I mean, cultural statement, strongest political. I mean, there are so many ways I can read that, I'm afraid. Like I said, in terms of a political precedent, especially in terms of foreign policy, the connection I have always drawn is to the Battle of Waterloo, when Wellington and Blücher defeated Napoleon. Indeed, if it weren't for the other, then both of them would have been defeated separately. As for a cultural statement, I mean, you don't need to look beyond the cultural statement to the fact that they are Germanic nations. England is a derivative of Anglo-Saxon, and if you're going to find some sort of halfway house between German and the English, it's to be found in the Dutch. So there's no reason as to why there has to be this this greater animus derived here. But as I was illustrating with the language issue, it seemed that the concreted identity around a post-Latin script identity for the language was a means to further alienate the English patrimony from that of a wider Germanic community, which had existed within Germany. But I'm almost becoming too convoluted. Going back to my point about the Third Reich, the Third Reich, like I said, was retroactive continuity representing the triumph of the created Germany over the recreated Germany, being the Kaiserreich. And this was a German nationality that, in terms of really trying to illustrate this point, is freed from its historical constraints, a la Prussia. And this is articulated in the notion of the national community. We go to Deutsche Folk. There are various folkish movements that originate in many other sort of political manifestations, even Bolshevism. But for the National Socialists, it originated in the Volksgemeinschaft. And as far as I'm concerned, the Volksgemeinschaft as an ideological statement transcends the narrow confines of a territorially defined nation. And most importantly, the Volksgemeinschaft opposes the foundations of the legitimacy of the new German Weimar Republic, and by extension, the international treaties it abided by, the treaties of Paris, which it saw as treasonous to the national community, the Volksgemeinschaft. This is why looking at constructs like the state identity and nationhood and all these things are so complicated and so liable to be misused or at least misunderstood, because what I believe about the Volksgemeinschaft is that it epitomizes that indeterminate identity. And I believe it also tries to configure German identity within history. It is a process of becoming. The Volksgemeinschaft has not yet manifested in terms of whatever destiny it is supposed to arrive at. I'm not going to go too deep down this rabbit hole in terms of the overall intentions of Germany within World War II, but to apply Darwinism, social Darwinism and biological Darwinism towards this concept, you can't, from the point of view of those conceiving of the Volksgemeinschaft and folkish nationalism in late 20th century and early 20th century divorce these concepts from social and biological Darwinism, and whatever teleology of history is going to be determined by that. And that essentially is the created Germany. That is the Germany which is free from historical sort of leftovers or state structures, and why we can therefore reduce from it so much of the direction that Germany takes in the 1930s. Because what I'm alluding to here is a plethora of different concepts. One is Drang nach Osten, the drive towards the east, which further underlines the quote unquote deterministic struggle between the Germans and the Slavic populations. Another is Hyman's Reich, the returning home to the nation or returning home to the realm. There are obviously manifestations in the sense that there was a great population transfer between the Soviet Union and Germany just before Operation Barbarossa, whereby the Baltic Germans were relocated towards Germany. And again, this whole notion of Hyman's Reich, to encapsulate it, look at all these Eastern Germans, the Ostdeutsche, in all of these territories, especially locating them around Poland and Bohemia and Russia, and to a far lesser extent, focusing on countries like Romania and Hungary. And again, the drive, this evolving concept of the national community, which transcends national borders, is to amalgamate these people into a newly realized sense of German identity. And then, of course, to cement this idea of expansion without and internal consolidation and elimination of differences within, we have the implementation of the Reichsgau, which were party apparatuses, but in reality they demonstrated the qualities for being real governorships. And these were placed over the old dynastic divisions of Germany, which had existed since and survived the Kaiserreich, and indeed the transition from Kaiserreich to German Republic, Bavaria being an obvious example. So the Reichsgau were placed over the old structures without having to eliminate them outright. And again, this is part of the sort of structure of National Socialism, in that you have so much territorial friction and political friction between these various statelings and authorities competing with each other during Germany. And again, as we're seeing a broader process of Darwinism, so the whole constitutional makeup of Germany is undergoing its own process of Darwinist whittling out the weak, effectively. And this is to be applied to the old dynastic divisions, which have been seen as outmoded, such as the state of Prussia, for example, which had more or less been abolished even before the National Socialists came to power in 1933. If you look at the Reichsgau, in terms of their structure, they bear a semblance with the overall purpose of the département in France, which is to create a new political sect of borders internally with new governors or intendants who are loyal to the center, based around historically incongruent geographical boundaries. And that, again, is to further illustrate the point of what the Germans were doing during this period. But going back to my point I started this off, which is the return to the Latin script from Courant in 1941. It was actually to demonstrate that from, again, a point of view of uniting all of the quote-unquote Germanic peoples, not just quote-unquote German peoples together, the use of a specific cursive or a script which was unintelligible to other populations would actually act as an impediment in terms of incorporating new German or Germanic populations who had become citizens to the new Reich after the collapse of the original Kaiserreich, the largest segment of these being the Austrian and the Sudeten Germans, who were integrated from 1938 during the year 1938. Again, surely someone has a question for me there. The House of Windsor was a halfway house between Germany and England. It's far more complicated than that, if I'm going to be honest. If anything, the English thought being attached to the House of Hanover was an impediment, because it meant that having a German dynasty with such a large territory within Germany meant that we were tying our foreign policy to the continent too strongly. In the same way that a lot of Whig historians retroactively say the fact we lost the 100 Years' War was a good thing, because it meant that we could pursue a foreign policy independent of continental concerns. The logic remained. And indeed, you can say there was a bit of relief when Queen Victoria inherited the throne and thereby split Hanover off as a result of the Lex Salica, the Salic law, and Frederick Augustus instead became King of Hanover. Then his line was deposed by Bismarck in 1866. So point 18, does Germany exist? The answer as to what Germany even is wasn't settled, in my view, until it was completely defeated in the Second World War. The Allies that defeated Germany concluded that Germany existed and that its borders could more or less resemble those of the 11th century Germany, when Germany was still part of the empire. Internally, and Poland more or less resembling the old Limes Sorabicus, albeit not at the Elbe. Internally, the federal nature of Germany was now recognized. The new tribes would be severed from Germany forever, making Austria compulsorily neutral and eliminating Prussia. The unity of the German speakers was solved by forcefully removing them from every country east of the Oder-Nassau line. There were two Germanys now, of course, east and west, but both claimed sovereignty over the entire Germany, and that question has since been settled. This is to illustrate a tragedy that befell Germany's process of national becoming, that it would achieved a warp variation of the goals established by the nationalist factions in the late 19th and early 20th centuries. Moreover, that Germany's existence, the fact of Germany on the world stage, was so concreted over the previous 8 decades that 2 defeats and 2 world wars and total foreign occupation could not unmake Germany. By that, I'm referring to the American, the French, the British, and the Soviet occupations from 1945 until 1948, which then acted in terms of a new state genesis of the Bundesrepublik in the West and the DDR, the German Democratic Republic in the East. So the German question was settled, even if the Allies felt it necessary to go ahead and to abolish the state of Prussia. I've gone over the many reasons for that in the execution of the Nation of Prussia stream. I would advise you to go over and to look at that, simply because it goes into so much depth. But again, the fact that Prussia was abolished indicates that the Allies, again, if it were possible, if it was seen to be politically feasible, and it wouldn't make the occupation far more complicated, the option for simply abolishing Germany remained on the cards. If nothing else, it could have remained as a permanent zone of occupation. And to this, the preceding Germany simply ceased to exist. There was no peace treaty, which was concluded with the so-called Flensburg Republic that reconstituted after the assassination, after the suicide of Adolf Hitler and later of Joseph Goebbels as Chancellor of Germany. Someone is illustrating a point, Peter Whittaker again. The Ostdeutsche were craftsmen and merchants living and surrounded by Slavic peasants. To be German was to be a town dweller. It was an economic rather than a nation. Exactly. And the same reality existed within the Holy Roman Empire. The Germans were encouraged to go into places like Poland in the 13th century for that exact reason. They were an economic boon to the rulers of the time, the kings of Poland, and the same logic also existed for the Jews, it should be mentioned rather ironically. But the process of national reconstruction in the 19th century instead denotes these urban town dwellers, these Bürgerliche, differently, especially within the legal state of the German Confederation itself, because these are now universalized, less localized conception of what it means to be middle class, with ambitions for having a preponderating sense of authority over a representative democratic system or a parliamentary system. They were looking to places like France, and they were looking to places like Germany and Italy for the mode of government they wanted to inhabit and they wanted to dominate. In any such conception, the King of Prussia was in many ways a necessary evil, as he was considered in 1848. But as it so happens, the Prussian monarchy subverted the process. So yes, you're illustrating an essential point, is that these pockets of Germanness were in many ways isolated from the Slavic communities. But if anything, if you look at the Ostdeutsche Bürgerliche, they had more loyalty to the local rulers than in many ways the peasants that surrounded them, despite the ethnic distinction, because they owed their positions due to the grace and largesse of that local sovereign. Looking at Catherine the Great is a very obvious example. Um, but once you sort of sunder that link, especially as the Soviets did during the Second World War, then the assumption is that they're going to be more loyal to a newly constituted state that calls itself a German state and a state to which all Germans ought to belong. Then all of a sudden, these old historical ties of reciprocal obligations and loyalties, which have lasted centuries, way beyond this lifespan of a German state, begin to become contextualized. I mean, I think one of the most obvious examples of this is how the Russians began to treat their German populations after German unification in 1870. Alexander II begins the first prohibitions against the German proliferating influence in the Baltic states, for example. This had been something which had been confirmed during the reign of Peter the Great, during the Great Northern Wars, but part of the program of the later Russian Tsars, namely being Alexander II, Alexander III, and Nicholas II, was a program of comprehensive Russification, which came at the expense of the German populations. So the very existence of a quote unquote Germany actually pitted these populations against each other in a way that was never conceived of before. It's very interesting the more you think about it. But like I said, that differentiation between those groups and the severing of relations between the higher authority and the German urban dwelling classes in these cities engenders the logic behind Hyman's Reich, that no state polity is going to protect the rights of the Germans other than the German state itself. That was the logic. But again, I want to go back to this point that Germany's existence on the world stage had now been concreted over the previous 8 decades, that 2 defeats and 2 world wars and foreign occupation could not unmake Germany. So the German question was settled, even if the Allies felt it necessary to abolish the state of Prussia, to confirm that point again. And this far exceeded the pessimistic outlook of prominent figures in the German resistance, such as Henning von Treschow, who believed that when Germany lost the war, Germany would be reduced to the old borders of Brandenburg, which, for reference, is only roughly half of the boundaries of East Germany, not including Mecklenburg and Saxony. Indeed, Germany from the 1990s until a couple of decades later, I would argue 2015, is probably the date where things begin to radically change, was a remarkable story of economic success, at least, and a sense of national renewal after the elimination of East Germany and the unification of the Bundesrepublic, given the nadir that Germany reached in 1945. Perhaps in the original video, this point may have been misread, or perhaps I was being too subtle, but I don't see how anyone could possibly listen to this particular passage and come away from the original video under the misapprehension that I believe Germany does not exist. I believe that's given me no benefit of the doubt whatsoever, and trying to, I don't know, read whatever message you want to. If anything, again, I think this is a triumph of Germany in the 20th century, that in spite of everything, its existence was recognized by the powers that had defeated it so comprehensively. And going back to my final paragraph. What I hope this video has revealed, the original video obviously, is that the German road to nationhood was a Sonderweg, a special path relative to other Germanic nations. That term has been very abused and comes with a tremendous amount of baggage, almost universally pejorative towards Germany. But rather than throwing the term out, it should serve as a line in the sand. The path to German nationality is sensical, if idiosyncratic. Had the 16th century turned out differently, our entire conception of European nationality would be different. Now, this was obviously the premise of the video and why I thought it'd be interesting to to really uncover it, which is this whole notion of delineating a proper bounds for the Sonderweg. So for people who don't know, who aren't sort of really familiar with the historiography, you can say that the Sonderweg began as a process of allowing for German self-realization and exceptionalism. It wasn't a pejorative to begin with. Um, and it became bogged down with associations that German nationalism or supranationalism, ultranationalism, was really the reification of a bastardized form of the Holy Roman Empire, with the old sort of ideas of universality and the Christian and temporal mold being substituted by a sense of national hegemony over the entirety of Europe and by extension the world. That was the pejorative. And this relates to the reaction to it, which is the Anglo-American excoriation of it, of German existence. Even historians who have written so extensively on Germany and Austria, should be mentioned, like A.G.B. Taylor, are not immune as part of this sort of overall sense of Anglo-American excoriation regarding the whole Prussian mentality, the aggressive nature, and the fact that Germany is almost a unique blight in the history of Europe. You only need to go and listen again to the stream on the execution of Prussia to understand the extent to which certain theorists, Anglo-American theorists, sociologists, politicians. In fact, I included some lengthy quotes from later British Prime Minister Clement Attlee of the need to have a unconditional victory against Germany at all costs, even if a Prussian cabal were to have upset the power balance and removed the National Socialists from power. Such was the need to eliminate these problematic aspects of the quote-unquote German special identity or Sonderweg way of becoming or occurring as a nation. Now this, I wouldn't say necessarily evolves, because a lot of Germans had this in terms of a sense of national self-conception, but I want to focus on three historians, Hans Ulrich Wähler, Franz Fischer, and Hans Mobson. Indeed, Hans Ulrich Wähler has this concept. It's called class and habitus, the cohabitation of the classes, or deference, it should be mentioned, to a particular class structure or order. The pejorative really surrounding, again, a Sonderweg is not going to be settled within the stream. It deserves its own series of streams because it goes into the nitty-gritty about the whole basis of German social history in the Frankfurt School in the 20th century. You can, devote an entire stream just to the works of Jürgen Habermas, for example. But the presupposition with all of these historians, and indeed alluded to with the Prussia stream, is this conception that there is a teleology of history which arrives at the modern state, and the modern state is liberal and democratic. And history and politics need to be fused in a way in order to illustrate or allow for examples to reach the determined modernist conclusion, which is liberal and democratic. But Germany ought, according to these historians, again paraphrasing them, to have resulted in something reflecting this notion of modernity, but it did not. And the explanation given, typically, is that the Sonderweg, or the corrupted nature of the German path to modernity, which inevitably, as far as they're concerned, led to National Socialism in the 1930s, was predicated on Bismarck's subversion of that principle, which I mentioned earlier, which is a fact. It is a fact that Bismarck subverted the progress of German unification in order to achieve a temporary victory for the Prussian monarchy. And this is the origin of class and habitus, that it wasn't simply a state of the conquest of power by the German bourgeoisie, which is so much of the impetus behind the creation of Germany to begin with, one that Bismarck exploited and was able to essentially dupe into the creation of Germany. But that as a sense of the enduring fact that this class was denied their right to authority, their passage into power, that they owed a sense of permanent moral and political deference to the Junkers, to the Prussian German aristocracy in general. And in a purer sense, this is from the point of view, again, people who look at modernization theory and a prescribed path to modernity, is a path of national retardation. The enduring aspects of this, the deference to authority figures, and perhaps more interestingly, the idea that the Führer principle and the notion of totalitarianism is again an extension of this notion of class deference and the denied democratic potentialities of the middle classes. But then contrasting that, there is the point by Winkler, who contends against this idea of Zonderweg that there is no normal path to modernity, and I agree with him. I don't believe there is a concept called modernity. I don't. If there's a concept that exists as modernity, it is what people believe modernity to be. It doesn't exist outside of the reflections of historians and people construing that concept. It exists within a certain place and time and within a particular worldview and with a particular trajectory or purpose behind the state of this historical development. So from that point of view, we can say, okay, throughout the entire concept, we shouldn't be looking at history and figuring out how these nations arrived at quote unquote modernity based on these set of very arbitrary characteristics. You can say that allowing nations to reach this state of arbitrary characteristics by all means necessary is the founding principles of neoconservatism, which is if Germans cannot be made to be modern, and by extension in alliance with the United States based on these quote unquote Western democratic values, then they should be forced to. But that isn't something that satisfies me at all. When I look about the whole idea of the Sonderweg, I'm looking at this within a very specific connotation, which is the fact that throughout the 19th century, so many European states arrived at the point of view of nationality or the conception of nationhood or nation status. France, you can say, was far more advanced than other examples. Say, for example, those countries living within the Austro-Hungarian Empire or the Ottoman Empire. Indeed, you can draw this line and say that the path to nationality throughout most of the early 20th century was a very artificial one. And it could have only occurred as a result of the cataclysm of the First World War, which is why, again, I put all of these notions of modernity and the teleology of history into contention. Rather, it seemed that when the Russian Empire, the Ottoman Empire, and the Austrian Empire collapsed, that the nation state was a predetermined outcome. And that's why I revile against so many historians who look back at this and say that, oh, well, because the nation state triumphed over the Austrian Empire, say, for example, in the 20th century, thereby Austria was a moribund entity, and there was some form of great philosophical, intellectual flaw which allowed for the continuation of the state of the existence of Austria-Hungary. I will actually concede that the Austro-Hungarian politicians and the emperor himself actually invited comparisons and further sort of buttressed the flaw by making the empire a nonsense, essentially, by creating the constitutional farce, which was the imperial Reichsrat from the 1860s onwards, but that's another question. My point is that German nationalism arose on the corpse of the Holy Roman Empire. And as a result, the sublimated claims of German identity had a universality whose only sort of equivalent really in European history is French universality. And it's something that I encountered in my To Kill a Catacon, is that the nations, in particular the ones I was referring to in Kill a Catacon, were France, Germany, Russia, and Greece. As they all had in their previous instances as part of the Catacon a eschatological mission, when ultranationalism came to superimpose that identity, it emerged, you can say, as the most virulent forms of nationalism. In France, this already existed even before the revolution with Gallicanism. But in Germany, you can say in the 20th century, that German ultranationalism came to far supersede the French nationalism, which preceded it. And you can say for obvious reasons, based on the demographic realities of Europe that faced the state of European countries and nations in the 1920s and 30s. So if anything, when I'm talking about the use of the word Sonderweg, I'm trying to limit its usage within the most historically congruent sense possible. And I believe emanating out of a eschatological construct, the catacon, the Holy Roman identity, and subverting that principle to the national principle is where the Sonderweg can be applied, because I believe it is certainly true, and I believe it holds true throughout all of these various manifestations of the fluid nature of German identity up until the defeat of Germany in 1945, when essentially their identity was conceded to by the foreign powers that had essentially conquered and occupied it. Again, I could go into this at much further length, but I've already been speaking for 2 hours, and unfortunately there hasn't been as much of a back and forth as I hoped when I envisaged this stream, if nothing else to give my voice a little bit of a rest when I'm reading through your comments. But I think that's enough for now. This would have to emerge as a stream in its own right. And again, trying to rescue Germany from these pejorative connotations is obviously not something I've started. This has been an ongoing process now for a long time. But again, I just find it interesting that, considering some of the comments I receive, that a lot of people seem to miss that, and I don't quite understand why, unless they weren't prepared to listen to the entire video. But anyway, Angelica's Domain. Because this was a week early, is next week's stream going to be the Anglo-German Alliance or Christopher Dawson? Both. Both, hopefully. As you can see from last week, I'm getting to the habit of doing multiple streams a week, possibly. So hopefully that answers your question. British foreign policy was fanatically opposed to a German-Russian alliance. Creating chaos in Germany was crucial. Yes, that is also true. And to further understand that point, I would look at the Heartland theory stream that I did with Semiagog and Morgoth. Rotten meat. So basically, when industrialism ended, the Germans' identity as unique metropolitans, they settled down, became essentially immigrants, and grew unruly. I'm not quite sure what you're referring to. When I'm referring to the Bürgerliche identity, I'm not referring to it just outside of Germany. I'm referring to inside Germany as well. Such is the nature of cosmopolitanism and the financial sectors and large-scale investment. We're talking about guild associations being transformed into international conglomerations. Such is the process of the expansion and the use of capital and the growth of capitalism that essentially engenders a state of the necessity of political revolution at the same time. Again, I sound awfully Marxist when I refer to that, but again, maybe there was a passage, an article from Dawson, which I was reading before coming on here, which actually would have been quite useful in terms of illustrating this point. But again, it's the universality, and it's I wouldn't necessarily say the deracinator or the rootless nature of the middle classes, but nevertheless, it is the expectation of a share in power and the othering process directed against a set of feudal orders or German princelings, which justifies, in their sense, using a term from Koselleck, the critique and the crisis, that they had been excluded from power in Germany unfairly, and in order to justify the validity of their critiques, their almost Manichaean conception of politics as a series of conflicting religious sort of ideas and causes, that they can assume power within Germany. Because, like I said, historically and medievally, these people were contented to have that immediacy to the emperor, or in many ways to be subordinated to a local sort of ecclesiastical or princely structure. There is a faction of German Antifa who call themselves Anti-Deutsche. They believe Germany needs to be purged of national identity. The Anti-Deutsche are the pro-Israel wing of Antifa. I mean, that's really a separate question. The question of eliminating borders and eliminating nations is not the question that I really set out to answer during this stream. That's a whole different question. Hmm. Uh, in cursus, I was the biggest hater in that comment section. Well, welcome, in cursus. I'm happy you can make it for this stream. Hopefully, you don't despise this stream as much as you apparently hated the first one. Hopefully, I've elaborated on some of the points that you contended against. Right. I am going to leave it there, and I'm going to see you all next week. Thank you, everyone, for watching. Hopefully, it's been interesting to you, if nothing else. It just sort of occurred to me before going on the stream that I really need to eat something. I haven't eaten anything today, so I'm going to go away and I'm going to cook something. All right. Bye, everyone.